This podcast is based on information sourced primarily from police and media reports, but certain names and other identifying details may have been changed or altered for privacy and security reasons. While the events and cases discussed are based on real investigations, some aspects may be simplified for time and for narrative purposes. Voice actors have been used to read from statements or documents. All information presented is intended solely to inform and raise awareness. Hosts may discuss theories regarding the cases examined in this podcast, but such discussions are not intended to and should not be considered by the listener to be legal conclusions. All persons discussed are considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Listener discretion is advised.
This is Chief Anna Lally. Welcome to Somebody Knows Something, a podcast from the Elgin Police Department's Cold Case Unit. In this podcast, we will shed new light on cold cases in the city of Elgin by sharing untold details and by encouraging anyone with information to come forward. You will come along with real cold case detectives as they investigate active cold cases in real time and seek justice for the victims and closure for their families. We believe that the Elgin Police Department and our community can work together to bring closure to cold cases because we know that in these cases, somebody knows something. Elgin as a whole, it's just a great community. It's about 116,000 people. We like to call ourselves the city in the suburbs with about 50% Latin population. So it's a very diverse community. And so there's always something going on in terms of events or activities, but it's a small enough city where you still have that personal connection with people and you still get to know people and know their first names. So it's a really unique city and a great place to live. The Elgin Police Department, I will tell you, we pride ourselves on being dedicated to our community, educating our community, being engaged with our community, and most importantly, being progressive in how we police. We like to be the first, whether that's our body-worn camera program or creating our collaborative crisis services unit, pairing mental health professionals with police officers for a co-response model. We love to be the first. One of the things that we started looking at were cold cases. There have been cold cases in the past, national cold cases where somebody comes forward. It's one little piece of information that maybe they were hesitant to give, they were afraid to give, they weren't ready to give. That piece of information solved a case that was, for 20 or 30 years where people, the question is always there. It's always a question. What happened? Hopefully through this podcast, there is somebody out there who has that little piece of information to the puzzle that gives us what we need to solve that case. A lot of times the victims are the forgotten people in the criminal justice system. And then as a byproduct of that, their family. So you have family members who are still thinking about something that happened 10, 15, 20 years ago. It was important to me that at least from the perspective of the case and the police department, that we find a way to dedicate resources, time, money to ensure that our community who have suffered something very tragic, that we do everything we can to give them a sense of peace and a sense of closure. So it was time to bring it to the forefront, and it was time to, really invest some time and energy and effort. The detectives that work in our major investigations divisions are very busy. We would kind of ad hoc just look and see, can we maybe do something on this cold case? Starting this unit, this is something 10, 15 years from now that, Detective Andrew Houghton and Detective Matt Vartanian, that they are going to be the two pioneers in terms of starting this unit. It's important that you get people who are dedicated, who are enthusiastic, who are tenacious, and focused on solving a case and being able to provide that closure to a family or a loved one.
My name is Andrew Houghton, and I'm a detective with the Elgin Police Department's Cold Case Unit. I've been a police officer here in the state of Illinois since 2007, and I started my career as a patrol officer and then an evidence technician. As an evidence technician, I processed a number of homicide scenes before I became a detective here in Elgin in 2013. And during my time as a detective in the Major Investigations Division, I spent the majority of my time working on crimes against children cases, and I've also worked on numerous homicide investigations. I am a state-certified lead homicide investigator, and I have worked with the Kane County Major Crimes Task Force on major cases here in Kane County since 2021.
My name is Matt Vartanian. I'm also a detective with the Elgin Police Department's Cold Case Unit. I was also an evidence technician and processed numerous crime scenes, including homicides as an evidence technician. I've been a police officer here in Elgin since 2008. I spent the last 12 years in our department's gang crimes unit. My first 8 years was as a TAC officer, and then the last 4 years was as a gang detective. And then during that period, I was also an operator on our SWAT team for about 6.5 years. In my time in the gang unit, I worked on numerous homicides, and I'm also a state-certified lead homicide investigator with the state of Illinois. I also have extensive training in historical cell site analysis and currently assist our Major Investigations Division and our Special Investigations Group with digital forensic analysis for major cases, while also being assigned to the Cold Case Unit. So there are a few criteria that make a case a cold case. So first of all, it has to be at least 3 years old. Cases under 3 years old are actively investigated by a detective in our Major Investigations Division. But typically in Illinois, with some exceptions, the statute of limitations on a criminal case is 3 years. Now, there are certain cases where that statute of limitations is extended, and that is where we come in as the cold case unit.
Yeah, so felonies have that 3-year statute of limitations. But we also are going to look at certain cases under a specific criteria for cold case, and there's 4 different categories. So our categories are homicide cases, long-term missing persons, sexual assaults, and any unidentified human remains. Currently, we have 41 homicides that span back from 1971 to 2021, and 5 of them are in warrant status. That means we have warrants issued and charges approved on offenders from those cases. We just don't know where they are. So that leaves us with 36 active cold cases that are unsolved and not in warrant status. So our task is to kind of go back through those different cases and potentially reinvestigate those cases.
Yeah, so we're actively working to locate those wanted offenders on our warrant status cases. So we encourage anybody that's listening to check our website and provide any information that you might have regarding the location of these suspects in any of our cases, including those that are wanted on these warrants. One of the big things is we believe that several of these suspects in these cases that they've actually fled the country. So we're working with the local Kane County State's Attorney's Office and then our federal partners to kind of track down these offenders both here in the U.S. and then abroad.
Yeah, and regarding long-term missing person cases, we currently have 6. They span from 1982 to 2021. The first season of this podcast is going to be specifically about one of those cases. It's going to be a missing person case from 1983.
Yeah, and then on top of that, we have 26 cold case sex assaults that actually have sex assault kits with some sort of potential leads that are associated with them. And then these cases go back to 1996. So we are working to kind of review these cases in addition to the missing persons and the homicide cases too.
That last category, the unidentified human remains, luckily we don't have any of those right now, but certainly there's a possibility that we could have a case like that. So if some human remains were recovered at some point and we didn't identify that person for 3 years, those cases would come onto our caseload. Having a background in evidence is something that the majority of our different detectives have, and looking at these cases from that other perspective is really useful. It also helps us look back at these cases with a fresh set of eyes and see things that we can see in retrospect were maybe not necessarily missed, but could be investigated differently now. Yeah,
and as the time passes, the hope is that in some of these cases, there's somebody that knows something and is willing to come forward now, even after all this time. With any cold case, missing person or a homicide, it's not just the victim or the missing person that's affected. There are families, there's friends, there's coworkers, and even kids who are victimized as well when they lose a loved one. Reviewing these cases kind of gives us, the opportunity to really kind of focus our resources on these certain subset of cases, to just try to bring some justice and closure for the victims and the families.
There are definitely some unique challenges with cold cases. For instance, obviously, the big thing people are going to think about is technology. It's certainly changed over the decades. while we have blood or physical evidence from some of these cases going back 20, 30, even 40, 50 years, we have to determine what state it's in. Is it viable? Is their DNA still viable? What's the status of that evidence? Things like that. So there have been a number of technological advances over the past few decades, especially with DNA. DNA was not something that police were really aware of before the 1990s. So in a lot of these cases, we have items of evidence that were never tested for the presence of DNA.
Yeah. So Andrew and I were both evidence technicians. So we have a background in the collection and processing of physical evidence like blood spatter, fingerprints, DNA, and ballistics. I think that looking into these cases with that perspective is very useful. If we have to spend a lot of time going case by case, so we can kind of see like where the evidence takes us. Some of these cases were investigated by multiple agencies back then. So nowadays, for example, we basically handle all of our cases here in town. But if you look back like in the 1970s, for example, the Illinois State Police, the Kane County Sheriff's Office, the Cook County Sheriff's Office, and other local, federal, county, state agencies were all involved more than they would be today. That means that some of the evidence that might have been collected back then could actually be held by like one agency. A suspect may have been interviewed by a different agency. And then Elgin might have taken the kind of like the overarching approach for everything. So you kind of have stuff that's kind of pieced out everywhere. So we are kind of like looking for physical items of evidence that might be housed elsewhere instead of here in our, evidence collection area or a housing area. And also like reports too. It's trying to find out where all these reports have gone.
Yeah. The thing that people have to think about with these reports, nowadays, all of our things are digital. All of our reports are digitized. These reports we're talking about, oftentimes handwritten paper reports, carbon paper, things like that. And we have been able to digitize a lot of those physical paper files. But even reviewing them is really difficult, and it can be really time consuming because the quality isn't great. The clarity isn't great. It's hard to read different handwriting, things like that. So, I think Matt would remember we started this unit. We took probably 4 dozen boxes of different records up to an office and kind of went through those and categorized everything, separate our cases out. We have to go through every scrap of that paper for a case.
Yep.
So we have some cases that have hundreds or thousands of handwritten paper files associated with it that we have to digitize. And then we have to go back and make sure that we have compared what we digitized to what we have physically, because there could be one report or one piece of paper that's really important that we have to know we have it.
Right.
And if we prosecute a case, we have to turn all that over for discovery for the defense and for the prosecutors to have a full case file.
Yeah. Yeah. And beyond just like the reports and the evidence, people also really have to kind of understand the difference again in the technology. Like I was saying before, I'm responsible for processing like all the historical cell site information on cases that we work. So that means like I map cell phone records, basically what it is. So any records that we get from companies like AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, we can also map location data that's physically recovered from a device like a cell phone. This kind of just really helps us to understand like the area or the location of where a device physically was used. So nowadays, for example, like if we have a missing person, we can work in conjunction with a cell phone provider like an AT&T or a T-Mobile to receive like that location data, whether it's historical or real-time data, in order to basically locate a person that's missing. So that technology, it didn't exist in the past. Even in this first case that Andrew was just talking about, if that person had made a phone call back in 1983, it's very well could kind of give us a focus of like where that individual was at the time of that person's disappearance.
In addition to cell phone records and physical devices like cell phones, I spent 10 years handling cases that were involving social media, child exploitation, internet crimes, things like that. And social media is another huge investigative lead that we use today in almost every case. It could be a robbery, it could be a sex assault, it could be a retail theft. A lot of times we're getting social media data to place people different places, to see what types of messages they transmitted to different people. People are, deciding this is the action I'm going to take. We're going to coordinate what we're going to do. It's all over social media. So we have the ability to sometimes pull some of those records. Back then, that's just not the case. We don't have the ability to look at cell phone pictures from the party that this person was at in 1983, for example. There's no videos or selfies of them at the party.
Yep.
There's no cell phone calls that she would have made or any type of social media posts that she would have made about the party.
Right.
So all of those things would be things that we would use now, where we probably wouldn't be investigating this case, or we would investigate it very differently if it happened in 2023 versus 1983. the technology and like real-time location data is just completely different.
Yeah. And the other thing that I would add is like in a lot of these older cases, a lot of the people that were involved are dead. I mean, that's just kind of the truth of it. I mean, whether it's somebody that investigated the case, if it's, a crucial witness, a family member, maybe even a potential suspect, they might have passed on by now. That means that we have to kind of rely on all these written reports that we find in whatever condition they may be in, to kind of figure out what people said and did at the time of the incident.
Yeah. And you're looking back in these cases. I mean, we're talking 30, 40, 50 years ago. Not only are some of these people dead, we're trying to go back and find people that are still alive and track them down. You go through some of these cases, and the common scenario today would be Matt or I would interview somebody. We would take their name, their date of birth, maybe their driver's license number, some other identifying information like that. Back then, a lot of these reports are, hey, here's this John Smith guy, and this is the phone number we had for him. And that's it. So you're trying to track down who is this John Smith from 1983 or 1992 based on a phone number. And it's pre-area code. So it's a 7-digit phone number that some of those companies may not even exist anymore. We can't go back and just plug in this number and say, well, hey, who had this phone number in 1985? We just don't have the ability to do that. So part of the hope with a podcast like this is putting out information where people recognize names, people recognize people recognize information that they can give us and say, hey, I know you've been saying you're trying to track down this person. Right. I know that person. I went to high school with them, or I am still friends with that person. So we can try to track those people down, because our ability to track somebody down from 1980 or 1970 based on just a name and a phone number, or even a name and a date of birth, can be really difficult.
Yeah.
First and foremost, I think with this podcast, the whole purpose is really to try to solve cases. So in the case of Karen Sheepers, that's the case we're going to discuss this season. We want to recover her, whether she's alive or dead. The likelihood that she's still alive is not very great, but if she is, we would like to locate her. And if she's not, we'd still like to locate her, because we want to find answers to what happened in her case and all these other cases. When you're talking about 41 murders, 6 missing persons, the goal would be to identify and recover as many of those missing persons as possible, and also identify an offender and prosecute an offender in as many of those homicides as possible.
Yeah, I mean, we really want to use this platform to highlight, Karen's case and then the other cold cases that we have here in Elgin and the surrounding area, because quite frankly, we need help. We need help from people that aren't here, people around the country, around the city.
Yeah, I mean, Matt and I can go back through these cases. We can interview people. We can go through physical evidence. We can talk to the state lab or private labs, but somebody knows something about these different cases. That's just the reality. Someone told someone something, someone saw something, or in some of these cases, someone did something. And maybe those people now, as time passes, are willing to talk to us. No information is too little. Like, we would take any information people have on any of these cases, and we need people to come forward so we can keep these cases kind of in the limelight. Cases like Karen's case, so that people are interested in giving us information and helping us track down people. A lot of these cases are going to be solved more by the public than they are by Matt or I. It's going to be people coming forward and talking to us.
Yeah, I mean, podcasts, as a medium, they're just huge. I mean, we're kind of hoping that we reach obviously just outside the city of Elgin, because as time goes on, I mean, people move, right? They go outside of Elgin, outside of the state of Illinois, outside of the U.S. even sometimes. Our hope is that maybe there's somebody out there in New York or Colorado that is hearing us talk about this case, and that triggers something in their mind where 41 years later they decide to come forward and say, "Oh, I remember this," and that's a tip that could break open a case.
Yeah, and we've talked to people out of state on some of these cases, but trying to track those people down has been sometimes difficult. Yeah. So if we can get someone that maybe we don't even know about, that somehow hears about this podcast or hears that we're doing this and listen to it, say, "Oh, you know what? I live in Florida now, but in 1992, I did live in Elgin and I have this information." Right. That's sort of our hope, to try to go as broadly as we can to try to pull those people in.
Yeah.
This podcast, I think, will be unique in the fact that, Matt and I both listen to a lot of podcasts, just like millions of other people do every day. But I know there's different agencies that will put out an episode here, an episode there about one case and ask for information. We're going to do it a little bit differently. So for us, we're going to dive into this case extensively and just one case at a time. And we're going to do multiple episodes about a single case. And we're also going to do it as we're actively investigating the case. So our hope is to kind of, in some regard, take the listeners along with us while we're actively investigating a case and trying to resolve it, sort of in real time. And I think that that's kind of a unique thing that you don't see or hear on other podcasts.
So we're starting with a missing persons case from 1983. It's about a 23-year-old woman named Karen Sheepers from Elgin who disappeared on April 16th of 1983. She was at a local area bar, and neither her or her vehicle have ever been seen or heard from again since that date. During the investigation, both the Illinois State Police and the Elgin Police Department have over time periodically reviewed this case, but we wanted to take a fresh look at it.
And Karen's case is a good case for us to start with, we think, because a lot of the people that are associated with that case, they're still local. They're still in the area.
Yeah.
A lot of people are still alive. And not only that, family members, friends, coworkers have been really open to the idea of being interviewed on a podcast, whereas some other cases, witnesses in a homicide or victims of family members of a homicide might not be interested in doing that. They really are, which helps us kind of put this information out there. You know, even 42 years later, we have people that are more than happy to pick up the phone and meet with us and talk about this case.
Yeah, there's been, really, truly, like a lot of great support from people in the community about this case. I think that there's a lot of local people that still remember this case. And, one of our hopes here is just kind of reviewing, this to kind of start off this podcast will kind of not only highlight the fact that this unit exists, we're here, we have a cold case unit, but also kind of drive people to check out, our website and think, hey, maybe I know something about this case or another case. It goes right to our Elgin Police Department transparency page. And there's going to be links on there where you can actually click to, add a tip if you want to. We have an email set up. We'll have a phone number as well. So really, like Andrew said earlier, it's any tip. We're going to run with it. There's nothing that's too small, that we can kind of focus on. And it's just a way to just kind of get more people involved. And I think that this is just a great way to do it.
People can give us information a couple different ways. One of them is going to be an email that we set up. It's called coldcasetips@elginil.gov. Or you can also call a dedicated tip line we have that is 847-289-COLD, COLD, which is 847-289-2653.
Yeah, and you can also visit our website, which is linked on the Elgin Police Department's transparency page. So when you click on the cold case unit page, you'll find details about each cold case, pictures of the victims and suspects, and a link to this podcast, which then you could share with friends and family.
All these different options are going to have information and links on the podcast itself. So if you scroll down when you're looking at our podcast, we're going to have our contact information, our transparency site information, things like that as well. So we're hoping people will see those when they're listening to the podcast and take a look at it. Well, now that we've introduced ourselves to our listeners, we hope you will come along with us as we investigate the disappearance of Karen Sheepers. Karen was a vibrant 23-year-old woman who lived in Elgin, worked at a company called First Card, and went out with multiple coworkers to a bar called PM Bentley's in Carpentersville, Illinois on April 15th, 1983. In the early morning hours of April 16th, she simply disappeared, along with her vehicle, and she was never seen again. In our next episode, we will walk through the hours leading up to Karen's disappearance, hear from several of her coworkers, and introduce our listeners to the 6 theories we have about what could have happened to Karen. We're hoping that with your help, we can finally find the answer to the question, where is Karen?
If you or anyone you know has information about this case or any other cold case in Elgin, please contact the Elgin Police Department cold case email at coldcasetips@elginil.gov or the cold case tip line at 847-289-COLD. You can also review cold case information on the Elgin Police Department's Transparency Hub by going to elginil.gov and navigating to the Elgin Police Department's Transparency Hub, where every cold case homicide and missing persons case is listed with photographs and information about each case.
It is 9:06 here on the first shift on WRMN AM 1410 and WRMN Radio on YouTube. So in the last half hour, we heard about the making of the whole podcast, and you heard from Detectives Andrew Houghton and Matt Vartanian as we get this whole series underway. Hope you enjoyed that first episode in the last half hour. That's kind of what we're focusing on today for the final hour of the show as well, as we get into the Elgin cold cases. somebody knows something. And the two guys that I just mentioned are here with me in the studio now. And we're here to have our podcast aired. So what we're going to do is talk for a little bit here, then play the first podcast of Where is Karen Sheepers, and then we're going to talk again with the detectives to close the show here today. Matt's got his show Out to Lunch in the next hour. And just a quick weather forecast. It's still in the 20s out there. We're going to hit 32 for the high today, and then we're going to have a little snow, sleet, freezing rain, possibly ice all mixed together tonight, so beware of that. But you'll hear about that throughout the day here on WRMN. All right. Hey, fellas, how are you? It's Detective Andrew Houghton, right? Is that how you say it?
Houghton.
Houghten, yeah. I always get confused when it says Hough. It always throws me off a little bit. Like,
I get
Houghton,
Houghton,
all
sorts of stuff, yeah.
Yeah. Well, welcome to the show. Welcome back.
Thanks for having us back.
And Detective Vartanian's here with us, too. How you doing? Great. So we got this whole series starting, and you guys released it for the first podcast on Monday.
Yep.
So what's your the response you've gotten so far? How are things going with it?
Good.
I'd say generally positive.
Yeah, we're getting some good feedback from people. We've had some tips
Already got some tips?
on this case, but then also tips for some other cases where people have called in and provided information about other cold cases or asked us about other cold cases. So I think we've maybe 10 different tips in the last couple of weeks on various cases throughout the cold case unit. So it's been kind of nice.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about Karen Sheepers. I watched the podcast or listened to it last night. And that's the one we're going to hear. And then if you are listening to it today and you want to comment, you have any tips, thoughts, whatever, we have our YouTube feed still going at WRMN Radio on YouTube, so I'll pay attention to the comments there. We have our Image 360 information line at 505-926-1410. And we have our phone lines that you can call in the final 20 minutes or so once we get finished with the podcast at 847-931-1410 if you want to call and be a part of it. But as far as like actually officially leaving a tip, because you might know something about Where is Karen, here it is. It is cold case tips at elginil.gov. Cold case tips at elginil.gov. And the tip line is 847-289-COLD. 847-289-COLD. Now, the podcast that we're about to hear, when did you guys actually record this? A couple of weeks ago? Or?
Yeah, just a couple of weeks ago. Episode 0 was what you played, I think, in the 8:30 hour.
Yeah.
It was kind of just an introduction, kind of almost like a bonus episode for the podcast to kind of introduce the chief, the unit, Matt, and myself. And then this first episode actually talks about Karen's case, and we kind of talk about what we're going to do throughout the season.
Yeah. So that was recorded a couple of weeks ago, and since then, there's actually been kind of an interesting development that we were talking about off the air, where even Ben Demonia Boquist, as we called him, who's been handling the production for this whole thing, went along with you guys out to Carpentersville last Friday.
Yep.
And what was the purpose of that trip, and what did you discover?
Yeah, so we had received some information from the King County Forest Preserve about a vehicle that was recovered in the river. There's a group out there, a Facebook group called Friends of the Fox River, that had discovered it, posted it. That information had gotten sent to the King County Forest Preserve. And then they knew about our case with Karen Sheepers and the podcast, and they alerted us on that. So Andrew and I went out there on Friday, checked out the vehicle. We don't think it's the vehicle, just based on kind of the general shape of the vehicle, the window sizes, things like that. But it's kind of interesting that, the vehicle that she was in was a two-door vehicle. That last car that she had was a 1980 Toyota Corolla, and the vehicle that's in the river there is also a two-door vehicle. So kind of an odd coincidence, if you will, but you still have to do the due diligence and go out there and check it out just to kind of make sure.
Yeah, we had a tip shortly before we started the podcast as well regarding a vehicle up in that same area. So a tipster had called in, emailed us, and emailed the Forest Preserve Police Department about the remains of a vehicle that they saw on Google Earth that was in like a marshy area up off of kind of like Lake Marion Road. So we had gone out there several months ago and looked at that. And so we had some contacts with DNR and the Forest Preserve Police and stuff like that from that tip. That vehicle also was not Karen's vehicle. It looked like it was a pickup truck. But it kind of just goes to show that it's one of those cases that people in the local area, even before we started this podcast, were really interested in. People were still giving us tips even before we started publicizing that we're kind of doing this again. So
Yeah, what also is interesting is that was the area where the Carpentersville Dam was removed late last year. So
where this last car was recovered. right?
Yeah. So when we went out there and looked at it, I mean, there's some very large voids in where the river used to be, and you could see debris and garbage and things like that in the river. So just, kind of makes you wonder what else is in there.
Yeah. So the car is not 100% ruled out yet, right? But you guys don't have a feeling that it's the right car.
yeah, the windows. There's some different windows on the vehicle that look different from what a Toyota Corolla would. Corolla would be. I'm sorry, Celica. Toyota Celica would be. So we don't believe it's the same car. Obviously, we'll wait until DNR pulls the car and we can confirm, a VIN number or something like that, and 100% rule it out. But I'd say we're about 99% sure that it's not her vehicle.
So what's the schedule of them trying to pull that car out?
It sounds like that would be up to DNR to take it out of the water, and we're just waiting on a couple of phone calls back, but it sounds like they would wait maybe till there's less ice or snow in the river to actually physically remove it out.
Yeah.
And so could be a couple
I think
months.
there's safety concerns about getting into the river and getting it out, so they want to make sure it's in a time frame that they can, safely get down there and do the removal.
And then once they remove the car, then you'll be able to either determine if it's the car or not. But even if you're not 100% sure, it'll give you the opportunity to look through the car and see if there's any skeletal remains in the car or whatever, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Well, and see if it's related to some other case that maybe isn't an Elgin case, but a car in the middle of the river is not normal. I mean, it could be something where it's just there's some reasonable explanation, but you just don't know until they get the car out and we identify the car.
Well, this is all new territory, I know, because this cold case unit wasn't formed. When was the cold case unit actually formed? About a year ago then?
Yeah, so May of 2024 last year is when our chief made it and, kind of brought us along, together, and created it. So that was kind of like the start of it.
Yeah.
And that was her idea to kind of go with the podcast, to kind of get this exposure out there of these cases, just so people didn't feel like they, relatives or anybody, that were a part of these cases, that their cases weren't just forgotten about. It needed attention, needed people that were going to do it full time.
Yeah. So I guess my point was, though, let's say it is the car. Let's say it's Karen Sheeper's car.
Yeah.
It changes all these podcasts. Doesn't it?
Sure
It'd be a good thing.
Yes,
It'd be a good thing, but there are a few podcasts in this series that have already been recorded, and if suddenly that becomes Karen's car, then you got to go at it in a whole new direction, don't you?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I think we would still have content to obviously talk about.
Yeah.
I think even in this episode that people are going to hear, we talk about kind of our 6 different theories, and one of those could be that her car's in the river. But when we get to that point in our episodes, I'm sure Matt and I will talk about if we were to find Karen's vehicle in the river, it doesn't mean the investigation's over. We have to figure out how did they get there? Why is it there? Was it accidental? Was it intentional? It opens a whole host of new questions, right?
Was the car found, I know we have to get to this, but was the car found in the river right off of 25? Would she have come down 25 on the way back to Elgin from the bar that night? I mean, I know there's many different things she could have done.
Yeah.
But let's just say she decided to drive home from the bar that night and ended up driving into the river. Yeah. Would that have been the natural route from between the bar and her house here in Elgin where she would have driven off into the river?
This car would have been north of where she would have gone. If you're thinking about where she would go, it would be basically 68 and south. So Route 68 or Route 72 and south. This car was north of that.
Okay.
But we don't
so
know.
It wouldn't be the
don't
natural...
know where she went when she left the bar.
Right.
Was she intoxicated and went in a different direction, or got turned around or something like that. We just don't know that. But we think we've identified probably the 2 most likely routes that she would have taken had she driven back from PM Bentley's to either her house or her boyfriend's house. So that's where we're kind of focus our search when we start doing searches. We're working with a company to try to come up here probably in March or April to do some sonar and dives and things like that to try to look at that possibility.
Yeah. Well, should we play the podcast?
Sounds good.
Sure.
Okay. I'm with Detectives Andrew Houghton and Matt Vartanian, and they are the cold case unit, and we are analyzing and trying to figure out and solve the mystery of what happened to Karen Sheepers that night back on April the 16th of 1983. So let's go ahead and play the podcast that talks all about that night at the bar at PM Bentley's in Carpentersville.
This podcast is based on information sourced primarily from police and media reports, but certain names and other identifying details may have been changed or altered for privacy and security reasons. While the events and cases discussed are based on real investigations, some aspects may be simplified for time and for narrative purposes. Voice actors have been used to read from statements or documents. All information presented is intended solely to inform and raise awareness. Hosts may discuss theories regarding the cases examined in this podcast, but such discussions are not intended to and should not be considered by the listener to be legal conclusions. All persons discussed are considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Listener discretion is advised.
This is Chief Anna Lally. Welcome to Somebody Knows Something, a podcast from the Elgin Police Department's Cold Case Unit. In this podcast, we will shed new light on cold cases in the city of Elgin by sharing untold details and by encouraging anyone with information to come forward. You will come along with real cold case detectives as they investigate active cold cases in real time and seek justice for the victims and closure for their families. We believe that the Elgin Police Department and our community can work together to bring closure to cold cases because we know that in these cases, somebody knows something.
My name is Detective Andrew Houghton.
And I'm Detective Matt Vartanian. This season, we are investigating the case of Karen Sheepers, who disappeared on April 16th of 1983. In this episode, we walk through what we know about the hours leading up to Karen's disappearance to give our listeners a structure of what happened and led to this investigation. We will also talk with several of Karen's coworkers who were at the party the night she disappeared.
Throughout this season, you will go with us to sites that were related to Karen's disappearance, and you'll hear us talk directly with people who knew Karen and to people involved in her case. And you will hear from new witnesses who were never spoken to until now. You know, Matt, like you said, in this episode, we are going to have some actual people we talked to. We're going to play portions of 2 actual police interviews that we recently conducted as part of this investigation. And throughout this season, we're going to use real audio from police interviews and from actual people involved in this case as we investigate it in real time. Unfortunately, because some of the people in this case are dead, we're also going to use voice actors and statements. We're going to have people read actual documents and statements from our case, and we're going to make those statements kind of try to come to life. We're going to release some of those documents and some of these different reports for the first time publicly in this podcast. And our goal is to recreate that information to kind of help Karen's case come home to people and be something that is interesting to listen to, but also brings the case to life.
Yeah, so with that, I think it might be helpful for us to start with a physical description of Karen.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So Karen was 23 years old on April 15th in 1983. She's about 5'7", weighed about 125 pounds, and had long brown hair and brown eyes. She was kind of described by everybody we spoke to as very pretty, very friendly, someone who really made friends easily, things like that. And there's some photographs of Karen on our website, so we encourage people to go and check that out. I think visualizing Karen and other people in our cold case homicides and victims and missing persons is helpful as well, because it really humanizes who those people are and shows that they're not just some random person. They're actual people.
Yeah, I mean, they're people, right? The victims and the missing people from these cases, they aren't, statistics. They had lives, they had friends, families, in some cases they had children. They had their own goals and ambitions. We really want people to understand that this case and other cases are not just some case that's sitting on a shelf. These represent real people and their families who deserve justice and answers.
We're going to start with Karen's morning. So April 15th, we kind of looked into the weather for that time period. And on that day, it was pretty windy. It was a little below freezing in April, kind of what you would expect in Chicago in April, that, late winter, early spring kind of weather that we get. It was just above freezing, and around 7 a.m., she would have probably been getting up to go to work because she got to work around 8 o'clock-ish, somewhere in that time frame. And the weather is going to be kind of important as we get into this later on.
Yeah, and April 15th was tax day. So Karen had just gotten her tax return that week and deposited about a little over $1,000 into her bank account. And her bank account is also something that becomes kind of important later in the case.
Yeah, it definitely does. So we know Karen lived at a house. She lived in an apartment actually inside of a house that was located at 311 Lovell Street in Elgin, which is on the east side of Elgin. The house was separated into an upstairs and downstairs apartment, and she lived alone in that apartment on the second floor of the building.
Yeah, we're going to visit that location in a future episode.
Yeah, that episode should be an interesting one for all the listeners to hear. We know she goes to work that morning. We should probably talk about how she got there. So She lived at 311 Lovell, which again is on Elgin's east side, and Elgin's separated by the Fox River. So she worked at the First Chicago Bank Card, which was on the west side of Elgin in a single-story office building off of Davis Road. So she had to drive to work. She didn't live close enough to walk. She didn't carpool with anybody else. So she drove across the river on April 15th in her vehicle, which was a canary yellow 1980 Toyota Celica. It had distinctive accent stripes, these red stripes along the side, and it had an Illinois license plate of XP8918.
And that vehicle was a manual transmission vehicle, right?
Yeah, it was a stick shift. You're right.
Okay. So that's kind of an important detail, I think. I mean, I know that some people can drive stick shift, but it's not like every person knows how to do that. And not a lot of cars nowadays have that. Most of them are automatics. I think it's a skill that someone would have had to have learned, from somebody. And since we know that her car also went missing, it's important for us to kind of remember that. It's not just her that went missing. It's also the vehicle as well.
Yeah, the car is a big part of this case.
Yeah. And I mean, in the 1980s, it was a lot more common, like I was just saying, for there to be a manual transmission than kind of what we see today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, we have to remember the car is a big piece of this. So a lot of times you have these missing person cases where the person just up and disappeared. But in this case, not only did she disappear, her car disappeared. If someone drove her car off, they would have to know how to drive a manual.
Right.
So we know she worked all day and she drove up to this bar. But if she didn't drive her car, someone else did. They have to be able to drive that car.
Yeah. So I'm looking at her bank record right here. So she was paid $344.88 that day. So she had gotten her tax return and her paycheck. That total amount would have been somewhere around like $1,500. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So it was her payday. So like you said, she got paid that Friday. She got paid that day.
Okay. So she would have had money if she needed it for something. So we know that she had already paid off her car. So she owned it outright. She had her rent, but there were not a lot of other bills. I mean, she was attending classes at Elgin Community College, and she would have been paying for things like that and gas, groceries, or other normal like day-to-day things. But she was making pretty good money in 1983 as a single woman who was living alone.
Yeah, so she was making somewhere around $25,000 a year, which is pretty good money for her at that time. And she had told a coworker when she got off work, sometime around 4 or 5 p.m., that she was going to head up to this party. And she told them, hey, if my boyfriend Terry calls, if he calls my desk, let him know I'm just going up to the party.
Yeah.
That kind of makes me think that it must have been fairly common for her to call her at work.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's not uncommon that happened. And then it sounds like that they left work and that we believe that she went home and possibly changed clothes before the party, right?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a dispute when you go through the case file and some of the newspaper articles. We're not 100% sure if she went home and changed and then went up to the bar, but she definitely went to the bar.
Yeah. So
she may have made a stop and changed clothing and then gone up there, but that's something we don't know. It may be important. We're still trying to track that information down. So one thing we've never given out was her full clothing description. I know in missing person cases now, that's something we typically do give out. That was never given out publicly before, so we are giving that out publicly now for the first time. There was some information about her clothing, wearing a tan corduroy coat with a hood, but we know that she attended this party and she was wearing a black and white striped blouse and blue jeans along with that jacket.
Yeah, and so we're also, kind of going through and updating all of the missing person websites and things like that to reflect this information so it's out there for the public. She was also wearing a fairly distinguishable watch. I mean, that information was released before, but in case people didn't know, it was a Wittenauer brand wristwatch.
Yeah, so she potentially went home and changed clothes, or maybe she wore what she wore to work to the party, but we know she goes from Elgin to Carpentersville because this bar is not located in Elgin. That becomes kind of an issue too.
Yeah.
P.N. Bentley's is a bar up in Carpentersville. She lives in Elgin. She works in Elgin. The bar was located in the Meadowdale Shopping Center, which was the place it was kind of known for live music at the time. It's just north of Route 68 on Route 25 in Carpentersville.
And she drove there again in her yellow Toyota Celica.
Yes. So she drives the Celica either to her house and then up to the bar or directly to the bar from Elgin.
Okay. So she parked at the bar, headed inside, started to hang out with coworkers and have a few drinks with them. And it sounds like by all accounts, everyone was having a great time. They were listening to the band, having some drinks. Didn't really seem like there was any issues.
Yeah. The coworkers said that she parked somewhere in the first few rows from the bar in the parking lot. And it's kind of a shopping center. So it's a big parking lot that runs along the bar there. We know that at least 16 different coworkers come to this party at some point throughout the night. Now, they leave at various times. Some leave pretty early. Others stayed until about 1:30 or 2 a.m., and the bar closed at 2 a.m.
And at this point, no one really remembers or kind of knows when or if Karen left specifically.
Yeah, they know some key things throughout the night, but no one remembers the exact time that she would have left or recalls seeing her leave.
And I mean, from what we know, one of those events involved her coworker, Marianne, right?
Yes. So originally, the coworkers had kind of limited information about their interactions that night, which, in going back and talking with them, it sort of makes sense. This party was not Karen's party. It wasn't her birthday, right? So it's not a situation where people are keying in on what she's doing throughout the night. Right. It was a party for this program that they had completed. They were doing a new project as well. So it was a celebration just for the company kind of overall and her group overall. And so no one's really paying specific attention to everything that Karen's doing.
Right.
But we know that talking to Marianne, she recalls now, since we've re-interviewed her, that she did have an interaction with Karen in the parking lot around 9:30, and that was not reported back in 1983.
Right. Okay, so Marianne saw Karen get out of her car around 9:30 p.m., and that interaction then happened in the parking lot.
I remember yelling across the parking lot, "Karen, don't forget we have the meeting at 9 a.m. tomorrow."
Okay. Do you remember around what time you left?
Probably around 9-ish, maybe.
Okay, because I know she stayed. So did you maybe see her in the parking lot, like going to her car or something? But you remember seeing her in the parking lot and having that interaction with her at some point?
Yeah, some people just stayed for a drink, but
okay.
I had, along with some other folks, had something to eat, as well as I was drinking iced tea. Yeah, iced tea, I believe.
Okay.
So I'm not a big drinker.
So around 9:30, you walked out, and Karen also had walked out and gone to her car.
About several of us went out at the same time.
Okay. And then you're saying you yelled across the parking lot to her, like, "Hey, don't forget we have a meeting on Monday," or something? Okay. And then you left?
Then I went home, yeah.
I mean, Marianne also said that she was not drinking, so her account holds, I would think, more weight than others, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, she's not drinking, so she seems a little bit more reliable.
Yeah.
She said she was having some iced teas and hanging out, and then she leaves around 9:30, and she's pretty confident that's around the time that she left. So she sees Karen out there in the parking lot. But we know Karen goes back in the bar because some other specific things definitely happen after 9 or 9:30 p.m.
You're talking about the phone call to Terry, right?
Yes. Karen called Terry sometime between 9 and 9:30. We don't have an exact time, but somewhere in that time frame. And she called from a payphone at the bar. So we do know that they talked because we talked to some of her coworkers and some of the police interviewed Terry. So we know the phone call happened and we know he answered it, and we can corroborate some of that telephone call and that we know that it connected. You know, in fact, one of Karen's coworkers, Eloise, actually saw Karen on the phone with Terry, and she described the call to us.
Well, I think at one point I went out into the entryway for some reason. Maybe the washrooms were that way. I can't really remember. But I do remember her being on the phone because at that time, of course, what did we have? Pay phones. Sure. And I remember her being over there in the corner, and I couldn't hear the words, but I could see her gestures. And she was frustrated.
Pretty animated.
Yeah.
Okay.
And she wasn't on the phone all that long because by the time I got back to the table, she was there pretty quickly after that.
Okay. Did you talk to her about like the contents of the phone call or who she had called, things like that?
I didn't talk to her, but she kind of let everyone at the table know she had just tried to call Terry and that he couldn't come.
Okay.
And she was not happy with that.
Okay. Yeah. Did she say anything else about her conversation with Terry that you recall?
No.
Okay.
And just to kind of clarify, Terry never showed up at the bar that night?
No.
Okay, just a phone call?
Yeah.
Okay.
And actually, once Karen relayed that information from the phone call, it was like she did put she tried to go on in a positive way. Not that she was devastated by it, but it's just like, I'm not going to let that
I'm not going
ruin
to be
my
dragged down by
evening.
this. Yes.
She's kind of annoyed, but
Whatever. I'm going to have fun tonight.
Yeah, so she was apparently kind of annoyed that he didn't come up to the party, and he later claimed that he had a reason why he didn't want to be out too late. I mean, he had to work the next morning pretty early because he had some morning preparations to cater a dinner for his job, so he declined to come to the bar and meet her.
Yeah, and so he told Karen, well, hey, you can stop by the bar after you get out if you want to. And according to different people in the investigation, it was probably common for her to go down there on the weekends maybe and stay at his house because they did live separately.
Right. So Terry, he lived in Elgin too. So he lived in the 500 block of Barrett Street, which is in the downtown area of Elgin here on the east side, kind of the near east side, if you will. That's the same side of the river as Karen's house and the same side of the river as PM Bentley's as well.
Yes. So it's also important we remember that all three of these locations are on the east side of the Fox River.
Right. Again, that might be something that is important here.
Absolutely. I mean, when we talk about the different theories of what could happen, that plays a role in some of the things that we look at.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Terry died in 2015, so we can't get details from him. We just have to rely on what he told the police at the time, the interviews that he gave to local area newspapers, things like that.
Yeah, true. I mean, but some of Karen's coworkers did shed some light on her end of the phone call since she complained to them after she hung up on Terry.
Yeah, so it sounds like Karen was kind of annoyed. Like Terry didn't come up there. She's frustrated that he's not coming up to the bar. She takes the effort to go down and call him to come up there. But she kind of tells her, hey, I'm not going to let this ruin my night. I'm still having a good time.
Okay. I mean, so the phone call clearly happened. I mean, Terry was at his house in Elgin around 9 p.m. or 9:30 that night and talked to Karen. Coworkers can definitely kind of corroborate that. And they did say that he did tell her that he was not going to come up to the bar.
Yeah. And she almost makes it sound like when she tells her friend Karen that she's not going to go to Terry's house afterwards, kind of a tit for tat. Like, if you're not going to come out and see me, then when I'm done here, I'm not going to come down and see you either. But, that could change. We don't know.
Right. Yeah. And then, I mean, that kind of really comes down to the final thing that people really remember about Karen that night, and that's the hula hoop contest.
Yeah. So the band had promised this hula hoop contest. They had a live band that night. And by midnight, they still hadn't had this contest that Karen wanted to take part in. We talk about Karen's background. She was very musical. She played piano. She played saxophone. Right. She liked music. So they go out there and see this live band. And she wants to get up there and dance and have a good time.
Right.
And so she takes it upon herself to go up to the band and say, hey, when are you going to start this contest? I want to do this hula hoop contest. Right. And so she goes up there, and the contest happens about 12:30 a.m. Multiple people see her go talk to the guy in the band.
Right.
And the band lead singer, who has since died, in the interview to police in 1983, remembers Karen coming up and talking to him. He describes that same black and white blouse that she's wearing and jeans, and says, yeah, she wanted to have the hula hoop contest, so then we had the contest. That would have been about 12:30 a.m. on the 16th.
Yeah, so, I mean, after that, no one really has any specific memory or recollection of seeing Karen at all, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we know that at least 6 employees were there for the contest based on the timelines they gave us, roughly.
Yeah.
And then people kind of start filtering out of the bar. It's probably around 1 o'clock, and no one remembers specifically seeing her leave, at least at this point.
Yeah. So, I mean, April 16th, 1983, at about 12:30 a.m. or so, that's really the last time that she's seen him. We can verify that, right?
Yeah. We think she left potentially around 1, but 12:30 is the last verified sighting that we can get, at least at this point.
Yeah, so we should, definitely mention that Terry did work that day. So he worked catering at a spaghetti dinner for the American Legion in Elgin, reportedly from the early morning hours to the late afternoon hours. And he never called Karen and reported that he did not see her on April 16th, which was a Saturday.
Yes. So Sunday rolls around. It's Sunday, April 17th. And Terry says that he did call her several times. But again, this is a landline to her apartment, kind of like we talked before. We know Terry's in his apartment at 9 or 9:30 on the 15th because she calls him on a payphone and it's a landline. There's no cell phones. And then again, he calls her from his house on the 17th, from his house on a landline to her house on a landline because there's, again, no cell phones.
Yeah. So Monday rolls around and Terry still hadn't heard from Karen. So he called her work and learned that she wasn't there at all, didn't show up to work. And that was when he decided that he needed to file a report with the police.
Yeah. So it's April 18th, 1983, at 2:56 p.m., Terry reports Karen missing. And that's what makes this case more difficult because you have over 48 hours basically to account for, from 12:30 a.m. on the 16th until 2:56 p.m. on the 18th.
Right. And so here we are almost 42 years later, looking back at this case and, just trying to determine like what actually happened to Karen. I know that we've discussed this at length, as we kind of have read through this case and started to investigate it on our own end. Basically, we've kind of decided, right, that there's 6 different main theories, that could have happened to her, during that night. And that is kind of like the reason that we're going to investigate it, because there's just so many different directions that this kind of could go. I think it's really important that we, kind of take the tactic that nothing is off the table. And we're going to just kind of dig into it and investigate it with really an open mind, kind of like a fresh perspective. We just can't assume that something happened. We have to look at it from all angles.
Yeah. So we want to make sure we look at every option and we're being open to all of them. So let's kind of run through the 6 theories on our case here, Matt. I'll do the first one.
Okay.
The first one is that Karen made some kind of decision. So she either left voluntarily to start a new life somewhere, or she took her own life. At the time, police believed maybe she just left to blow off some steam and would come back, and they had some reasons to think that. I think it was a kind of common thought process for missing persons in that time period.
Yeah.
Karen had just gotten her paycheck, her tax return. She had paid off her car. So she had a substantial amount of money in her bank account. She would have the means to leave. She'd been living on her own for a while, so she knew how to do that.
Right.
Police learned that according to Terry, he and Karen had just called off their unofficial engagement a few weeks before she went missing. And she was somewhat estranged from some people in her family, most notably her father, who she hadn't really spoken to in person in a number of years.
Yeah.
Did Karen just leave, or did she harm herself in some way? We have to at least kind of consider that as one of the possibilities.
Yeah. Theory number 2, would be something happened at the bar. Something happened at PM Bentley's that night. Was Karen abducted in the parking lot, or did she agree to go somewhere else with someone that she had met at the bar? And one witness claimed that, she saw her talking to some bikers that were kind of both inside and outside the bar. Did she go home with one of them? Did one of them take her? Could it, somebody that's there at the bar actually had something to do with her disappearance? Did she leave drunk and left with somebody, kind of willingly or otherwise? We kind of need to look at all the people that Karen may have met, as well as the people who worked at the bar and frequented, PM Bentley's in the spring of 1983.
And then theory number 3 is the drive home. So if we bypass 1 and 2, we assume that Karen has left willingly in her car and she drives away. Did she stop somewhere? Did she meet someone along the way or have something happen on her drive home? There are a number of different serial killers that were operating in the Fox Valley area in the 1970s and 80s. And there are some victims that have some similarities to Karen's case. So do any of those have anything to do with her disappearance? We have to take a look at that too.
Right. Theory number 4, Karen made it home. She arrived in Elgin at her apartment, possibly under the influence of alcohol, and something happened. We will look into people who lived and worked in Karen's building, including the previous tenant for her apartment, who was the prime suspect in the kidnapping and murder of a 14-year-old girl in 1976. In addition to the people that lived and worked in the building, it was reported that Karen kept the location of her apartment secret from her stepmother. There are some reports that Karen's stepmother may have learned the location of Karen's apartment and that Karen did not have a great relationship with her. Could Karen's neighbors from 1983 have new information? Could her stepmother have some insight? Is Karen's apartment and the people associated with where she lived the key to solving what happened to her?
Yeah, we definitely have to look at the apartment. And then we have the boyfriend, the typical, the boyfriend did it kind of scenario. So like we said before, unfortunately, Terry passed away. He did work with law enforcement and he worked with some different psychics and different things trying to track Karen down. But could something have happened involving Terry? Despite her statement to her coworkers that she was not going to go to Terry's house when she left the bar, did Karen change her mind and go down there? We definitely have to look at Terry as a viable option in this case.
Yeah. And then the final scenario, theory 6, Karen crashed into a body of water somewhere between Elgin and Carpentersville. Something happened on her drive home. Did she run off the roadway, and go into the Fox River or, other, bodies of water that was along her route, like a lake or a pond? We really have to kind of explore the different routes that she may have likely taken home that night from PM Bentley's. Really both to her home or to Terry's house.
Yeah, because she could have gone to Terry's.
Right. And just kind of really have to dig into that theory and kind of see like, what do we have? And with that, we kind of plan to bring some, updated technology to kind of help us in that search.
Next episode, we're going to look into the possibility that Karen left willingly. This would be our theory number one that we just talked about. So did she decide to start a new life somewhere, or did she take her own life? We're going to talk a little bit more with some of the people that knew Karen best to kind of evaluate those different possibilities about her character, what she was doing, things along those lines. And then in the coming episodes, we're going to look at each of these 6 theories kind of in depth. We're going to conduct interviews with people, past witnesses we're going to search for, and we are going to interview new witnesses. We're even going to interview some potential suspects in this case and review the case without us assuming anything about any of those 6 options. This season on Somebody Knows Something, we will dive into all 6 of these theories regarding what could have happened to Karen Scheepers. In our next episode, we will begin our investigation as we talk to Karen's family and introduce Karen's backstory to our listeners. Hopefully learning more about her background will help us evaluate each of these different theories and lead to some new information to answer the question, where is Karen?
If you or anyone you know has information about this case or any other cold case in Elgin, please contact the Elgin Police Department cold case email at coldcasetips@elginil.gov or the cold case tip line at 847-289-COLD. You can also review cold case information on the Elgin Police Department's Transparency Hub by going to elginil.gov and navigating to the Elgin Police Department's Transparency Hub, where every cold case homicide and missing persons case is listed with photographs and information about each case.
It's 9:45 here at WRMN, AM 1410 and WRMN Radio on YouTube. I am with the detectives, and you guys have both listened to it a couple of times now, right?
Yeah.
We kind of listened to it there while we were talking, but you've heard it a couple of other times? Is that right?
We've gone through and edited and made some changes, and
Yeah.
it's been a new process for us, not doing a podcast in the past, so.
Yeah. What's your reaction to your own podcast? I mean, did you come out of your own first podcast there with any questions, or were the questions that you took from that podcast that led you to the next few podcasts? How do you feel about
I feel
that?
like we're pretty happy with it. I think that as you go along, the next couple episodes, we do interview Karen's family, friends, coworkers. We visit PM Bentley's, where she disappeared. So the first 2 episodes here, we felt like it was a lot of us talking, and we're hoping that some of these episodes moving forward are going to be a lot more of us interviewing people and bringing a lot more people on board. So hopefully that's helpful for people and they enjoy it. But we wanted to give kind of a structure of what happened and just kind of walk people through, this is what information we have about the case. And then our next episode, like the end of the podcast said, we sat down with a number of Karen's family members to talk about her. She had 8 brothers and sisters, so she had a really big family. And you know, they've been really great, really supportive. And
How many of the 8 brothers and sisters are still alive?
I think all of them are.
All of them are alive?
The oldest was Gary. That's her older brother. He still lives in Sycamore with his mom, with his mother. She's turned 90. Liz is the mom. So Gary and Liz are out in Sycamore. He helps kind of take care of her. And then her brother Dale is the next one after her. So it's Gary, then Dale, or Gary, then Karen, then Dale. And then she has a sister, Susan, who we spoke with, and then the other siblings, one other girl and a bunch of other boys.
Wow, okay. So there's a bunch of people still to talk to. And that's what you're going to cover on subsequent episodes. How many podcasts are spent on the Karen Scheepers case? Are you done doing the podcasts on? I guess not. If you have more people to speak to.
Right.
How many have been recorded so far, and is there a number that you plan to dedicate to this particular case?
What, 3?
Yeah, we have 3 or 4 that are recorded right now. Our goal is to get probably around number 12. So 12 episodes to cover this case. And we feel that there's just a lot of different layers to this investigation and a lot of substance, different areas that we think the investigation could go. And as we'd kind of stated before, we truly don't know what happened. And that's why there's so many different theories that are out there. And it's very important for us to make sure that we stay neutral and don't have any type of confirmation bias, to support, a theory that we have or anything. We don't know what happened, so we have to investigate everything.
Besides this first episode that everyone just heard, we'll probably spend 1 to 2 episodes on each of those 6 theories. So that puts us at 12 or 13 episodes, something like that. Because there's just a lot of content for us to get into, a lot of people for us to talk to. And I know off the air, like we were talking, we've talked to a number of people, but there's still a ton of people that we're trying to track down and talk to. So that's part of the reason we're doing this.
Yeah.
So it's not like It's not like a television series where you're like, where can we go next with this? We have to get 12 episodes out of this. This is all, the number of episodes is kind of being based on all these things that you still need to find out.
Yep. Yeah, we definitely don't have 12 episodes just recorded and we're just dropping them out there. We're still actively, we're hoping to record something today. We went on Friday up to PM Bentley's with one of the guys, with Ben from here, and recorded. We met with the owner of the bar, kind of saw the layout of what the place looked like at the time. So that's going to be something we're going to talk about in a future episode. So we're going out every couple days here, trying to record with different people, interview different people, and then, we have a structure what we think the podcast is going to be, but I know, like we talked off air, like if we were to find some new information, we can go in a totally different direction.
Yeah. To touch on PM Bentley's, if anyone that's listening has any pictures,
is it still a bar? What is it now?
Yeah, so it's actually a dentist office now.
Okay.
When we went up there, it was good for us to kind of get a good understanding of the layout of what it was, and I describe it as almost like a mall within a mall. So there's storefronts on the outside, and then there's a couple main doors that take you inside, and then there's more additional spaces inside of there. And that's actually where PM Bentley's was. It was actually inside. So there's currently a dentist office in the space where PM Bentley's used to be, and then just additional, spaces, retail spaces, if you will.
It's really a huge space. I think getting in there, I didn't expect it to be as big as it was. It's a very large venue. We're trying to see if anybody has photos of PM Bentley's from it was opened in 1981. I think he said they closed around 1985, roughly.
Okay.
If someone has photos of the exterior, of the interior, like they went to a concert there, they would have live music 6 days a week.
Oh, wow.
So it was a pretty active place for that 3 or 4 years it was open. We would love to have, photographs or people that have been there kind of give us a little bit more background of just what the place was like.
Yeah, and honestly, like if people knew people that work there, like we're still looking to track down a couple of people that work there. That would be very helpful for us. So if there's anybody that has that information, please share it.
The owner gave us, in 1983, gave a list of the employees that were working the night that Karen went missing. We probably talked to about half of those employees. I think there's 12, something like that, 10 or 12 employees. We've talked to maybe half. But the other half we'd still love to talk to because, there's people that maybe waited her table. There's a couple bartenders that were spoken to that did remember talking to her at one point. We'd like to re-interview those people. And there's some people that were just never interviewed. So there's employees that worked there, like a girl that was the waitress for their area. She was never interviewed. So we would love to talk to her about this case.
It's 9:50. We have 2 phone calls, 847-931-1410. You'll have to throw the headsets on probably to hear the phone calls. Let's start with this caller. Might be Edward. Let's find out. Good morning. Welcome to the show.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. The only question I have is, if you offered a reward, have you seen cases that offer reward versus cases that don't offer reward? Are they solved more frequently?
We have not done that at this point. I know from going through old newspaper articles, there were rewards offered in this case initially, but that was, 40 years ago. I don't know, it's something I hadn't really thought of doing now. I mean, we can certainly talk with our chief about that as a possibility. I mean, I think that we would potentially be open to offering something if it was going to give people a reason to call us and give us information, that extra thing to kind of put them over the hump, So it's a great question. I hadn't thought of that.
Thanks. I wish you luck in this. It's a tough case you're against.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for calling in. Interesting thought there. Offering a reward, does that bring more callers out, more tips out?
I think it potentially could. You'd never know.
Yeah. Maybe the extra motivation somebody needs.
Yeah. 9:52, one more phone call here. It's good old Bob calling at 847-931-1410. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning. Very interesting program. I really, really enjoy it. I've been trying to follow. Unfortunately, I had a couple of interruptions. My question is, we know that she left the bar. What happened to her vehicle? Was it ever found? Did she drive away? Did somebody else drive her away and her vehicle stayed there? What was the status of her vehicle?
Yeah, it's a good question, Bob. To answer that, her vehicle has never been located or found. So, and that's one of our theories. Did something happen to her inside the vehicle when she left, or did something happen at the bar and somebody took her vehicle? So those are some big questions that we have.
Yeah. Did she crash the vehicle somewhere that just hasn't been found? A body of water, something like that is also a potential theory. So I know Matt and I have talked quite a bit. The car going missing is something that is really unique to this case. Like you said, Bob, if the car had stayed at the bar and she went missing and then, the police went up there and found her car, it would really change kind of the calculus of what we would look at. Or if the car was found at her boyfriend's house, or if the car was found at her house, or if the car was found abandoned somewhere, we would have a much better, we would have a piece of evidence, potentially. We would process the vehicle and stuff like that. But we would also have an idea of, okay, well, at least her car went to this location. Did she go here? But the fact that people saw her around 12:30 p.m. that night, she may have left around 1 or 1:30 a.m. that night, and they don't know if she did or not, and then the car's just gone, makes it really difficult for us.
A car is a little difficult to hide, a little more difficult than a body.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Bob. All right, a couple of early phone calls, and I have Linda Wildtree Hitzman checking in on our Image 360 information line. She says, I knew someone that worked for a long time at that business. Unfortunately, she has passed, but her husband might know of her, and I will give you his name when I call later, or Mark can give you my number. So
yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Any little tip helps. If anybody that remembers maybe lived in Carpentersville at that time, maybe you went to that bar once in a while, anything helps. So 847-931-1410. So one thing that happened that night, do we know what time she went to the bar? What time she got to the bar that night?
Probably around 5:30, 6 o'clock. The bar opened at 4 p.m., I believe Frank told us.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
the first coworker that got there was somewhere around 4:30, 5 o'clock. And then we should kind of clarify, it was not necessarily like a company-sponsored party. It was basically a group of her coworkers in her division that decided on their own to go out and have this function because they were celebrating. They were celebrating some people had graduated from the program. They were celebrating about a new project they were working on. So it was just a group of coworkers from that division that went out. It wasn't like a company Christmas party or a company, Valentine's Day party or something like that.
Right.
We kind of talk about, too, that also makes it more difficult for us because it's not like it was Karen's birthday party. People aren't really keyed in on exactly what she's doing the entire time she's there. It's just a bunch of people. Imagine that you and your coworkers are like, hey, let's go get some drinks after work. And you go out, that's basically what happened is they went out, a group of them.
Yeah.
Well, we got 3 minutes and 2 calls, so let's try to squeeze these last 2 callers in. We start with Cleveland Dennis. Good morning, Dennis.
Yeah, I'm intrigued. What about the VIN number? How many times they run that VIN number for that car? How about if they checked all the junkyards? Anybody ever tried to do anything with that car and they junked it in the end years later if they've been using it?
Yeah, so we know that there was a substantial amount of search that was done after this happened, where that vehicle was sent out to all different states to try to see if anybody had come across any remnants of that vehicle, to track it, to see if that car was sold anywhere. So there was pretty extensive workup that was done on it at the time, and nothing came back at all on it.
They also did search local salvage yards, things like that. Because it was a yellow kind of unique car, in addition to going physically to some different locations, they flew over different scrap yards trying to see if they could identify the car, kind of dumped in somewhere, and that also came up empty.
Yeah.
They did aerial searches of water as well, but there were some rumblings of searches of bodies of water beyond just aerial searches, but we don't have a lot of records of that. So that's what we're kind of looking at going back and doing is some underwater sonar and things like that as well.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for your call.
Thanks for the
Dennis.
call.
Take care.
Yep.
All right, 9:57. So we only have about a minute and a half. So that's a good start to this today. We may need to, in the future, leave more time for calls and thoughts because I think that probably some people can go back and watch this again. We'll see the next episode, and we'll just have building questions on this as the episodes go on. So, how would you like to finish this today? The best way to watch it, if you haven't seen, or if you want to see it again, would be how? Would you say just on your favorite podcast?
Yeah, so the podcast is available on all the major platforms: Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio,
Amazon.
Yeah, you can go to our Elgin Police Department Facebook page. There's a link on there. It has actually a QR code that you can scan that'll take it to the actual podcast. And it also has a QR code that'll take everybody to the transparency page. And then you can navigate to the cold case page for more information too.
We'll do episode 2 in 2 weeks, I guess, 2 weeks from today in the 9 o'clock hour. And you want to set the stage for that? You know what's coming up next in the next episode? Or
Yeah, so now that we've kind of talked about what happened to Karen or the information we have about what potentially happened to her, episode 2 is called A Desperate Choice. Or I'm sorry, is called basically Who is Karen? And so we met with a number of her family members, and we just kind of talk about Karen's upbringing, Karen's background, how this has impacted the family, and kind of look forward to getting more information about her background and her character, some things like that.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Detectives Andrew Houghton and Matt Vartanian. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. All right, coming up next, Matt's got his show. It's Out to Lunch, and I'll be back tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. on the first shift right here on WRMN. Have a good one.